First up is going to be Austin Steelman. Austin is a PhD candidate in U.S. history at Stanford University. His dissertation connects American evangelicals' commitments to biblical inerrancy and constitutional originalism in a larger intellectual tradition of the religious right. David Byrne teaches at Santa Monica College, and he is the author of the book Ronald Reagan, An Intellectual Biography. And Logan Sawyer is the J. Alton Hush Professor of Law at the University of Georgia Law School. He is currently at work on a history of originalism and party politics. He has also spent some time in government, working as Associate Counsel for the Homeland Security Council and as a trial attorney in the Department of Justice's Office of Consumer Litigation. So this is going to be a pretty excellent panel. We'll have these three papers. I'll make very brief comments, and then we will open it up for questions. I'm not entirely sure it is either. Let's see what we can do. Yes, I am turning on the mics. Anyone have mic skills? Yeah, I'm pressing the button. Let's see. I'll give it just a second. How is that? Is that amplified? How about now? I feel like I'm... Is that? Yeah. There we go. That's a little aggressive, so I'm going to turn that down. Okay.
All right. So in August 1980, Ronald Reagan at the Dallas National Affairs Briefing Conference delivered what's a sort of now famous rhetorical masterstroke in addressing the large evangelical audience, saying, "I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing." To then resounding applause and enormous evangelical support, among other support, in the 1980 Reagan Revolution, in a way that now lets us know that evangelicals became Republicans and a part of the Republican coalition in a way that's held particularly strong through to the present. I think in many ways, the sort of popular understanding and the scholarship that is that in terms of political capital, Reagan got evangelicals on the cheap. That in many ways, Reagan didn't have to do that much in terms of policy, and that particularly in the first term, Reagan was focused on tax cuts, deregulation, addressing issues of the Cold War, and that evangelicals and social conservatives were largely sidelined, and that in many ways, they ended up disappointed, not getting what they had bargained for in terms of substantive policy. Indeed, there's much to this account. Evangelicals were particularly disappointed in the first term. Things like the Department of Justice's failure, as was promised, to support Bob Jones University in defending their refusal to comply with civil rights laws and losing tax exemption. The appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, who was a sort of disappointing moderate, led to disillusionment for leaders like Jerry Falwell and Timothy LaHaye at certain points. But I'd like to return to that same 1980 speech and suggest that maybe we've missed a little bit and that evangelicals may have gotten more than we've recognized in the Reagan administration. So Reagan also said, "When I hear the First Amendment used as a reason to keep traditional moral values away from policymaking, I'm shocked. The First Amendment was written not to protect the people and their laws from religious values, but to protect those values from government tyranny. This is what Madison meant when he drafted the Constitution and that precious First Amendment. This is what state legislatures meant when they ratified it, and this is what a long line of Supreme Court decisions have meant. But over the last 2 or 3 decades, the federal government seems to have forgotten both that old-time religion and that old-time Constitution." Now, Reagan knew what he was doing here, as did Reagan's staff who helped plan this speech. This was building on a long-standing popular originalist idiom for evangelical politics that evangelicals have been using by this point for a half century. In 1985, Attorney General Ed Meese famously unveiled the jurisprudence of original intention that we now know as originalism as the sort of guiding constitutional ideology for the Reagan DOJ and, to the present, the dominant ideological viewpoint in constitutional politics for the conservative movement. I think in realizing the evangelical roots of this and the evangelical connections in bringing originalism into the Reagan administration, we can see that while we've often remembered that Reagan was crucial in making evangelicals Republicans, we maybe have failed to realize how successful Reagan was, perhaps more than any other president, his administration, in making Republicans evangelicals. So I don't want to get into this full history of evangelical constitutional originalism, although hopefully I'm able to in my dissertation. But it has this long history, goes back to the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the 1920s. Influential evangelical theologian J. Gresham Machen, who sort of ties together his understanding that Christianity has sort of veered from biblical inerrancy and sort of revealed truth there, and that the American nation was sort of erring from its constitutional founding, and that going back to the original founding was sort of crucial. He was a major critic of the Federal Department of Education, which may have ring some bells for those of you familiar with politics and sort of promises in the Reagan era, as well as the New Deal. And over the years that follow, Machen's sort of intellectual progeny and some literal students, as I'll mention, follow with concerns about the Supreme Court. Decisions like McCollum v. Board in 1948 that ruled certain release time religious education unconstitutional. Brown v. Board, especially for white Southern evangelicals. The Engel decision on school prayer. The Abington decision on school devotional Bible reading. And of course, the 1973 Roe decision, where a lot of evangelicals begin to articulate the fact that the Warren Court in particular is sort of straying from the original intent, sometimes animated to this level of a Christian founding or a Christian constitution that they'll claim, and that this sort of judicial lawmaking was sort of particularly problematic. Now, there's a story of legal originalism that talks about Robert Bork and that talks about Raoul Berger, and this is an important story about originalism's rise in the law schools. But key evangelical leaders were organizing around this constitutional politics before Bork had started enrolling in law school. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, this, and the important electoral majority that brings this, and I think, as we'll see, the way the Reagan administration rolls this out suggests that it's actually this evangelical constituency and this way of approaching text that's really driving originalism. So in the 1970s, this original scholarship gets kicked into overdrive as sort of, especially Roe and Watergate leads to the sort of decline of Billy Graham's public star for a moment, as he's a sort of evangelical moderate voice in some ways, and more ideological voices, particularly people like Francis Schaeffer, come to the forefront. So Schaeffer is a sort of missionary turned author, evangelical guru turned political actor, an ally of Jerry Falwell, who made documentaries, wrote books that were extremely influential for young evangelical voters. And he had a large argument about the decline of Western civilization, this new term secular humanism that became popular with evangelicals in the era, and concerns about it, especially its advance in what he called sociological law at the Supreme Court. You can see him in his documentary sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court as he tells evangelical audiences that America is sort of headed for ruin, headed for this secular view that he sees as straying from a longer history, but particularly an American Constitution that he saw as founded and steeped in Christianity. So I don't want to sort of do this. You can do a broad look at evangelical influence in the Reagan administration, looking at people like James Watt at Interior, who's a sort of Pentecostal, C. Everett Koop as Surgeon General, who is a co-author and in the documentaries with Francis Schaeffer. But I want to focus a little bit on Ed Meese in particular and his friend Herb Ellingwood, who was a sort of more ardent Pentecostal. And Ed Meese was a Missouri Synod Lutheran. I can talk about that a little bit, which is something that doesn't, I think, to the American public, didn't code as evangelical, but did believe in the tenets of biblical inerrancy that evangelical leaders saw as central. So in some ways, I was saying, like, Meese is almost the reverse image of Jimmy Carter, who has the evangelical affect, but not the theology. And Meese sort of has the theology, but not necessarily the affect. And Herb Ellingwood, who is known in D.C. as a sort of speaker at fundamentalist conferences, is known to be leading Bible studies in the office, having opinions written about why they're constitutional or not. But all that to say is they're influential in bringing, both Ellingwood and then Meese in some ways are influential in bringing these evangelical voices to the Reagan administration. And I first want to revisit one of these first-term issues that seems like sort of political sort of small potatoes, right? In some ways, this is the 1983 Year of the Bible, which is important for evangelicals, but not particularly politically substantive, I don't think, from most other people's perspective. And in 1982, Bill Bright of Campus Crusade for Christ is writing to Ellingwood and to Meese asking them for a year of the Bible. And what happens is this gets passed up to Reagan, who doesn't act on it immediately, but they do decide to send Meese to the 1982 Congress on the Bible. And Bill Bright has written in his invitation to Meese, and I'll sort of quote, this is a long quote, but I think it's important. As you know, the Bible is the foundation on which our republic was built, and from its storehouses of treasures have come the teachings and the laws that have helped our nation to become the greatest nation on earth. Now, in recent years, as you know, a new philosophy has crept into every fabric of society. Humanism, a religion so declared by the Supreme Court, has increasingly become the religion of the land. As a result, many other problems of gargantuan magnitude are threatening to destroy our country, at least to rob us of our freedoms. For this reason, we feel the need for calling America back to the Word of God and to prayer. When Meese speaks to the Congress on the Bible, he rips straight from Bill Bright's letter to him. You and I know that the Bible is the foundation upon which our republic was built, and that from its storehouse of treasures have come the teachings and the laws that have helped our nation throughout its history. Whether he borrowed this out of speech-writing laziness, political acuity, sincere belief, likely some combination of those three, it became clear in this speech that Meese was tying this old language of the Bible and the Constitution together for an evangelical audience familiar with it, repeating a line that Reagan often used about, with all the laws created, none improving one iota on the Ten Commandments. In 1983, Bright's request for a year of the Bible finally happens, and in Reagan's announcement, he repeats similar language, talking about the Bible and its teachings help form the basis for the Founding Fathers of abiding belief in the inalienable rights of the individual, rights which they found implicit in the Bible's teachings. He goes on to say that this is the same ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So again, even though the year of the Bible isn't particularly politically substantial, you can see the beginnings of this textualist ideology that fuses both a religious mission, a sort of particular history of the American founding, and notions of constitutional change that are the sort of seeds of originalism. So once we sort of fast forward then, I think here, for the sake of time, to Reagan's second term, and you have Meese appointed as Attorney General. This is really significant for evangelicals who see themselves as having now a sort of social conservative insider in the Attorney General's office. His appointment to the Pornography Commission is another signal that these sort of moral crusades that are important to them are also going to be important. And then as in the sort of lead up to and including this Meese's unveiling of this jurisprudence of original intention, I think there's three things that can help us see the evangelical influence at this time. One is in May, the New York Times reports that Herb Ellingwood is the proposed nominee to be Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Policy. This is the office that will vet judges. And again, this Ellingwood's someone who's far more outspoken, is in congressional hearings about a proposed Christian talent bank with Timothy LaHaye to get evangelicals into government. There's questions about using travel funds to give fundamentalist speeches. There's sort of a series of inquiries into Ellingwood's work, and Ellingwood isn't really as much isn't hiding these sort of religious proclivities in his politics. So this is really significant, and this is just 2 months before the originalism speech. So who's going to be vetting judges to decide who will be implementing originalism? It's going to be an evangelical right sort of leader. Then you have, in June, the Wallace v. Jaffrey decision, where the Supreme Court decides, and Logan's talked about this, we'll probably talk about this some today. This is a huge galvanizing force where a time of voluntary meditation and prayer in Alabama law and in public schools is struck down, and this is seen as taking angle even farther. Right? This is a sort of crystallization of the evangelical concerns that date back to the 60s, and now they're being ratcheted up. So this fight for the Supreme Court takes on sort of new salience. And then you can see even in Meese's ABA speech, his speech to the American Bar Association itself, that he begins with the sort of three issues that the jurisprudence of original intention will change. Sort of federalism, sort of Reagan priority, criminal justice, which by all accounts is a particular priority of Meese himself. And then he gets to what will be the most important in the upcoming term, he says, and that is the First Amendment. He says, most probably this term will best be remembered for decisions concerning the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That the amendment demands a strict neutrality between religion and irreligion would have struck the founding generation as bizarre. The purpose was to prohibit religious tyranny, not to undermine religion generally. And so, as Meese is as he's articulating this, he then goes on a sort of tour talking about this jurisprudence around the nation. He brings in more and more of this language of sort of evangelical language of originalism as he's traveling around the country, and evangelical audiences respond positively to this. If I can find it, I will there's a quote in Christianity Today about Meese. So Meese has the fight with Justice Brennan at the time, who calls this originalism sort of nonsense. And Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine, weighs in and says, this is a religious issue. Now, what Meese has recognized is there's these absolutes. Rather than a relativistic law, we can have absolutes embedded in texts. And in fact, as evangelicals, we know that God communicates ultimate truth through text in the Bible, that human language and fixed human language is a means of revelation, and that this fight between Meese and Brennan, far from being some legal minutia, is actually a religious question. And they'll say, all Christians should be paying attention to this. So how should this shift our understanding, that knowing these evangelical origins of constitutional originalism, how should this shift our understanding of the Reagan administration? For one, I think it shows that evangelicals actually got much more than maybe we've recognized. To be fair, right, the Bork nomination is stopped. Like Scalia is an originalist in '86 on the Supreme Court, but originalism doesn't start to work its way into law during the Reagan years. In many ways, this is a longer project. But as we think about changes in American conservatism since, saying Nicole Hemmer's book on Partisans does this great, that there's a breakup of sort of a Cold War consensus. You see changes around free trade, immigration. As we look toward Trumpism, you can see massive changes in tone from a sort of Morning in America, American carnage. You see these enormous contrasts, but what hasn't changed is a commitment to constitutional originalism, and that Donald Trump appointing originalist judges who make decisions like Dobbs, like 303 Creative, are really a way in which the Reagan years decision, and especially in the Department of Justice, is paying dividends for an evangelical movement that got much more in staying power in Reaganism than other elements of the conservative movement that have largely fallen out since. So, thank you.
It's great to be here at the Reagan Library. It's such a renowned collection of scholars. I feel very lucky. My topic today will be Ronald Reagan and ideas. Reagan was once called an amiable dunce, but Reagan was not empty-minded. He was more than an effective communicator with a sunny disposition. He was, in fact, an idea man. He was an avid reader and writer. Those closest to him always recount the amount of time he spent on these activities. One biographer estimated that he wrote almost 500,000 words. Many who met Reagan commented on the small personal library he always carried with him, filled with books on political philosophy and economics. The best example of Reagan as an idea man comes from the mid to late 1970s, when he hosted a radio show dedicated to expressing his thoughts on virtually every conceivable political subject. He wrote his ideas on index cards and little pieces of paper, many of which are housed in this library. His favorite topics were, not surprisingly, communism and taxes. Other topics Reagan tackled included the CIA, the FDA, food stamps, Rhodesia, visas, crime and punishment, rapid transit, the Electoral College, endangered species, pensions, the assembly line, Soviet refugees, human rights, and even the fall of Rome, which Reagan naturally blamed on rising taxes. Why does Reagan have the reputation as an intellectual lightweight? Well, I want to suggest that to some degree, Reagan cultivated this image. Reagan was first and foremost an actor. He enjoyed fooling others, getting people to believe something that wasn't true. His official biographer, Edmund Morris, was one victim. In January 1993, Reagan returned to Washington, D.C. to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from George W. Bush. Morris, who spent several years in close proximity with Reagan during his presidency, recounted, and I quote Morris here, "Afterward in the receiving line, Reagan took my hand and nodded with a patent lack of recognition. What had to happen, I told myself. Reagan finally stopped recognizing me. Yet the following afternoon, Fred Ryan, Reagan's retirement chief of staff, called me from Los Angeles to say that Reagan had remarked, 'I saw Edmund in the reception line this morning. I think he's waiting for me to die before he publishes his book.'" This is one example of Reagan feigning ignorance. This helps account for the underestimation of Reagan's intellect and explain why many are reluctant to study his ideas. Reagan's ideas are historically significant. That's going to be one of the themes of this presentation. But before discussing those, I want to give a little bit of context and background for Reagan's ideas. It is important to contextualize him. Any analysis of Reagan must begin with his Christian heritage. Reagan was reared in the evangelical tradition, which can be traced to the Second Great Awakening that began in the United States in the early 1800s. Politically charged, this Great Awakening paralleled the rise of modern democratic politics. Its leaders insisted that Christian principles should be applied to political and social issues. Politics and religion can never be separate for evangelicals. So Reagan emerged from this tradition, this intellectual tradition. What also needs to be emphasized and is significant for Reagan is, of course, a fundamental part of this Christian tradition is the universal nature of God in Christ. Like any Christian, Reagan was taught the universal nature of God's word. It was meant for all people. One of God's greatest gifts of humanity, of course, is freedom. For Reagan, freedom could not be separated from God because it was a gift from God given to all of us. For Reagan, freedom was a universal value. Let me read a quote from Reagan. He said, "All men and women yearn for the freedom that God gave us when he gave us free will." Reagan also said, "God meant for America to be free because God intended for each man to have freedom and dignity." For Reagan, God and freedom were inexorably bound. They could not be separated. And Reagan did view freedom as a universal value. He said, for example, he dreamed of a day where where everyone around the world could enjoy the same freedoms that all Americans enjoyed. As president, he declared everywhere around the world the cries for liberty. This idea of freedom as a universal value can not only help us understand Reagan's Cold War policies, which of course were characterized by an attempt to spread freedom to Eastern Europe, but even some of his more controversial policies, such as his more liberal stance on illegal immigration, which can be interpreted as a way for Reagan to expand American freedom. Right? For Reagan, everyone around the world should be able to enjoy freedom. This even means people may be coming here from other parts of the world. Reagan, of course, applied these ideas of freedom to economics too. He believed a free economy led to prosperity. Specific writers who nourished who nourished Reagan's appreciation for capitalism, or some of the luminaries of 20th century conservative thought, such as Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman. Reagan certainly read all these men. In contrast to John Maynard Keynes, these thinkers generally favored limited government intervention in the economy, even during times of economic downturns. And they helped shape Reagan's economic philosophy, his appreciation for free market capitalism. And as early as the 1950s, Reagan suggested that government intervention in the economy through high tax rates depresses productivity, leading to declining tax revenue. Let me read a quote from Reagan from 1958 when he testified before Congress as a representative for the motion picture industry. He stated, "The high tax rates and limitations imposed by the capital gains tax tend to make futile the capital investment required for the production of a motion picture. An even greater deterrent to the motion picture industry in this country is the reluctance of high-income tax earners in the talent field to make more than 1 to 2 pictures a year due to high taxes. Good story material has always been scarce. It is double so when successful writers curtail their output because of diminishing returns due to excessive taxes." Reagan continues that this hurts everyone because it leads to declining production. This leads to unemployment, which subsequently leads to declining tax revenue. Right? So as early as 1958, Reagan was arguing for a form of supply-side economics. He argued that raising taxes can even lead to declining tax revenue. By the late 1950s, Reagan began to recognize that these ideas were no longer consistent with the Democratic Party that Reagan belonged to. Reagan, of course, began his political career as a disciple of FDR. In fact, he viewed FDR the same way that many conservatives view him today. He idolized him. But Reagan was generally right when he said that he did not leave the Democratic Party left him. In the post-World War II era, many German neo-Marxists emigrated from Germany to the United States. A new left emerged, which had less room for patriots and free market supporters like Reagan. In the early 1960s, he officially became a registered Republican. In 1964, he gave the most important pre-presidential speech of his career. The Goldwater campaign needed a jumpstart. Many, including Goldwater himself, were a little ambivalent towards Reagan because some of his ideas seemed radical. Furthermore, the future governor of California was a Republican neophyte. But by 1964, Reagan's conservative convictions were sincere. So he's given roughly 30 minutes of airtime in hopes of saving the Goldwater campaign, the fledgling campaign. The speech, called A Time for Choosing, did not save the Goldwater campaign, but it did launch Reagan's political career, and it is a goldmine of political ideas. Anyone skeptical of Reagan as an idea man should read this speech. The speech argued that America was in trouble. The root issue was not FDR's New Deal, but LBJ's Great Society. This collection of programs inspired unprecedented federal expansion into fields like education and healthcare. Reagan warned of the potential problems with too much government intervention in these fields, specifically the lack of freedom and the oppressive nature of bureaucracy. Reagan asserted that as government programs grow in size, they create a larger bureaucracy, which citizens helplessly flail against, like a fly caught in a web. Reagan even began to equate these social programs with a sort of totalitarianism. He declared, "You can't control the economy without controlling the people. So we have come for a time for choosing. I suggest there is no left or right, only an up or down. Up to the maximum individual amount of freedom, consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism." Reagan specifically in this speech lambasted government programs such as welfare and Social Security. It was the way these programs worked for Reagan. He argued that every government program has administrative costs, and the larger the program, the larger the costs. Government programs, of course, tend to have high overhead administrative expenses because the bureaucracy must be paid and fed too. And there are other basic costs, right, such as rental space, travel costs, expenses for vehicles and supplies. Moreover, Reagan even argued in the 1960s that welfare spending actually perpetuated poverty by making people dependent on government. Even Social Security felt Reagan's wrath in the 1960s. He feared that in order to sustain the system, politicians would have to continue to raise taxes indefinitely. Whereas FDR envisioned Social Security as a way to expand freedom for older, needy Americans, Reagan argued that in the 1960s that it had morphed far beyond its original intentions into something that was becoming so entrenched that fixing it was becoming more difficult with each passing day. These ideas promoted a sort of populism. Reagan suggested that the bigger the federal government grows, the more powerful it becomes, at the expense of the people. He declared in 1964 that the issue of the election was whether America would be ruled by a small elite in Washington, D.C., or whether it would be ruled by the people. 5 decades before Donald Trump, Reagan feared the bureaucrats and elites in Washington, D.C., the power they were obtaining, and the threat they posed to democracy. These are some examples of Reagan's important foreign policy and domestic ideas. But from a historical perspective, Reagan's ideas about communism and the Cold War were most significant. Like most Americans during World War II, although he never accepted the virtues of communism, of course, he supported working with the Soviets to end the Nazi threat. But again, like most Americans, this evaporated at the end of World War II. Reagan's ferocious anti-communism emerged in the late 1940s. Some of his important sources that fueled his anti-communism were Whittaker Chambers, James Byrne, and Lawrence Bielenson. I want to discuss these men and how they shaped Reagan, his anti-communism. Chambers was a Communist Party member who busted the communist chains in the late 1930s because they suffocated religion. His 1952 book, Witness, is a story about a young man and his disillusionment with the communist movement. When explaining his own rejection of communism, Reagan cited Chambers and his conversion to Christianity. Reagan was particularly impressed with Chambers' recognition that communism promotes an irrational atheism. This, in turn, Reagan said, creates an irrational Soviet system that only promotes misery. For example, Reagan maintained that the atrocious Soviet policy, such as the Gulag, could not be separated from its atheist foundations. Atheism was at the root of communism for Reagan, therefore it could only promote human misery, such as the Gulag. A second anti-communist who shaped Reagan was James Byrne. Like many young American writers during the throes of the Great Depression, Byrne was seduced by Marxism. He became one of Leon Trotsky's leading American disciples. But Byrne changed his political affiliations during World War II, partly prompted by the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. He began to view Nazism and communism in a similar light. In his book titled The Struggle of the World, he said that communism, politically, it is based on terror and mass deception. Economically, it is, or at least tends to be, collectivist. Socially, it is totalitarian. So whereas Chambers cited communism's atheism, Byrne cited communism's totalitarian nature. Reagan would do both when criticizing the communist movement. He would cite Reagan, the atheist foundation, and of course, the totalitarian nature of communism for roughly the next 40 years. Significantly, too, Byrne lambasted the containment policies that the United States practiced in the early Cold War era. He called containment defensive and insisted that a defensive policy could never really win the Cold War. Byrne demanded a hardline, aggressive foreign policy against the Soviet Union designed at liberating the people of Eastern Europe. He believed the Soviet Union was weak and could be defeated. Reagan adopted some of these ideas from Byrne. Byrne especially loathed disarmament. He favored an arms race, believing that this would weaken the Soviet system. Let me read a quote from Byrne. "We can take the most enormous armaments building in stride, the Soviet bloc cannot." Let me read a quote from Reagan years later. Reagan says, "But now the Soviets can be faced with the fact that we can go forward with an arms race and they can't keep up." So we see Byrne's influence on Reagan. Reagan acknowledged that Byrne's ideas were an important part of his political philosophy against communism. Another important source for Byrne's knowledge of Marxism and communism was Lawrence Bielenson, a Hollywood associate. Bielenson argued that since the Soviets know no other morality than advancing communism, making any sort of treaties and agreements with them is pointless. They will always attempt to advance communism, no matter what. Then how do we stop them? Bielenson wrote in a book called The Treaty Trap that the Soviet Union retreats only when faced with strength. Controversially, in the post-Vietnam era, Reagan usually suggested advancing strength against the Soviets. For Reagan, peace through strength, showing strength, was a way to end communism. So this is some of the ways that thinkers like Whittaker Chambers, James Byrne, and Lawrence Bielenson influenced Reagan's anti-communism that would be practiced during his presidency. But of course, freedom was at the center of his anti-communist crusade. In a piece he wrote in 1961 called Losing Freedom by Installments, Reagan argued, "We can lose our freedom all at once by succumbing to Russian aggression, or we can lose it in installments. The end result is slavery." Even as early as the late 1940s and early 1950s, Reagan began to interpret communism the same way we look at Nazism and he began to interpret the Cold War the same way that we interpret World War II. It was a struggle against totalitarianism, a struggle that needed to be fought, and a struggle that needed to be won. He declared in a speech, "If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth." Reagan always maintained that the Cold War had to be fought and it had to be won. Of course, by the 60s and 70s, the Cold War's biggest battleground was in Southeast Asia. America's failure here showed some that the United States did not have the strength and power to win the Cold War. It suggested to some that the Cold War could not be fought. Some important foreign policy leaders began to preach détente and peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union by the end of the Vietnam War. Reagan could not tolerate détente and any sort of peaceful coexistence. He quipped, "Peaceful coexistence and détente were what a turkey had with its farmer, at least until Thanksgiving." Yep. Reagan compared détente to appeasement. He did not want war, but he believed accommodating the Soviets meant surrendering to the Soviets. In one handwritten address, he wrote, "The leaders of the 1930s saw the growing Nazi menace and talked of it, but reacted to the growing military might of Germany with anguished passiveness. World War II did not happen because the nations of the free world engaged in a massive military buildup. In most countries, including our own, too little, too late described the reaction to the Nazi military colossus." Again, Reagan believed, influenced by people like Byrne and Bielenson, that America needed to show strength, peace through strength. He insisted that, and I quote, "It is America's industrial and economic strength translated into military potential that represents the single guarantee of peace in the world." So for Reagan, a strong United States that confronted the Soviet Union was the best path towards peace. And let me emphasize that these were all Reagan's ideas before he became president. Right? By the time he became president in 1980, his foreign policy ideas had been clear for years. There's no need now to replay Reagan's foreign policy and his famous speeches during the 1980s. As we know now, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991. The degree to which Reagan contributed to this is still debated. I know there are other panel sessions today that will explore these concepts in more depth. But what is important for my purposes now is to show how some writers credited Reagan, specifically his aggressive foreign policy, for promoting the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they used his ideas to advance a foreign policy designed to spread freedom and democracy abroad. These writers have been called neoconservatives. They drew from Reagan. For example, in a 1996 article, Robert Kagan and William Crystal wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs titled "Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy." They echoed Reagan's ideas that America needed to play a dominant role in world affairs. They wrote, "The appropriate goal of American foreign policy is to preserve the hegemony as far into the future as possible. To achieve this goal, the United States needs a neo-Reaganite foreign policy of military supremacy and moral confidence." The authors demanded a more robust military budget. Roughly a year later, these same authors began turning their attention towards Iraq. In 1998, they penned a piece for the New York Times titled "The Bombing of Iraq is Not Enough." It began, and I quote, "Saddam Hussein must go," Kagan and Crystal wrote. What these neoconservatives inherited from Reagan was the idea that America should take an active role in thwarting totalitarianism and spreading freedom abroad. Influenced by Reagan and the fall of the Soviet Union, they believed that freedom and democracy were in fact universal values. To some degree, this was, of course, the position of George W. Bush. Continuing Reagan's ideas about freedom, its universal nature, Bush stated, "Liberty for the Iraqi people is a great moral cause and a great strategic goal. The people of Iraq deserve freedom. The security of all nations require it. The United States supports political and economic liberty in a unified Iraq." Bush also continued Reagan's ideas that God and freedom were inexorably bound. He declared, Americans are free people who know that freedom is the right of every nation in the world. It is the future of the world, Bush said. He said, and I quote, "The liberty we prize is not America's gift to the world, it is God's gift to humanity." For Bush, like Reagan, God and freedom were universal values that were inexorably bound. One can argue that Bush and other neoconservatives misinterpreted Reagan by failing to recognize that Reagan's ideas were a product of the Cold War, and that Europe, of course, a very different history and culture than the Middle East. Maybe Reagan's ideas are not applicable to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This very well may be true, but my point is to show the significance of Reagan's ideas and why they matter. It is not to judge the ideas or those who embrace them, but to show why they are historically significant. In conclusion, I hope I have shown that Reagan is an important thinker with substantive ideas. It is important to recognize that Reagan was not an intellectual simpleton. Thank you for your time.
Okay, let me just start by echoing the view that I'm thrilled to be here and grateful for the Reagan Center for making this happen. It's wonderful, as one of our speakers said last night, to be around a bunch of Reagan nerds. It makes me happy. As Nikki mentioned, I'm at work on a project that talks about originalism. The big question, originalism, when we think these are deep waters, but we can think basically about it as the idea that the most important thing about constitutional law ought to be the way the document was understood by the people who wrote and ratified the document, right? So for about 40 years now, almost every single Republican activist, elected official, and voter has thought that originalism is the right way to interpret the Constitution. Virtually every Democrat has disagreed. That is unusual, I think maybe even unique in American history. Political parties have fought over the Constitution, over particular cases throughout American history. We can think of dozens of examples of that. But this association of political party and interpretive theory, I think, is unique. The primary push of what I am trying to write is to challenge the view that that is a natural and inevitable state of affairs. Something like, to be a little flip about it, conservatives like old stuff, Republicans are conservatives, originalism is about old stuff, so of course Republicans are originalist. I won't get too much into that, but that would have surprised people in the 1950s who would have thought, at least in academia, the leading originalist theorist was William Winslow Crosskey. He was on the side, he was an ardent New Dealer on the Supreme Court. The person who was the most originalist justice was Justice Black. He was put on the court by FDR to support the New Deal, and because he was the most radical senator he could find, radical left senator he could find. So I think that it is not natural and inevitable, and that begs the question, how did we get to this state of affairs? And since we're at the Reagan Library, you'll be unsurprised to hear that me, along with almost everybody else, thinks that a critical moment was the 1980s when Ed Meese dedicated the Reagan administration to what he called a jurisprudence of original intent. So what I am working on, what I've been doing here, and what I want to talk to you about is understanding how it is that the Reagan administration got to the point where they decided that originalism was the right thing for them. I am a pushback a little bit on kind of the current explanations that people have offered. Those explanations start with the idea that there is a close association of the rhetoric of the Reagan administration with originalism, so there is a natural fit. I don't deny that that is true at all. I think that that's an important part of it, and Austin's work, he's doing more than anybody to really trace out the way that these resonances made originalism attractive to the Reagan administration, and I endorse every word that he said. But I don't think it's the only reason. There are arguments about that originalism served as a professional grounding in order to challenge the decisions of the Warren Court, so lawyers who were unhappy with the Warren Court. It helps select judges. You identify originalist judges. They're going to do the kinds of things that the Republican Party hoped. And then there's this view that a lot of people just think it's the right thing to do, right? This is just like constitutional. This is the way the Constitution will be interpreted. So they moved forward. I'm going to, I guess the right way to say is contextualize those. I think each of them have some truth to it, but I think they miss important parts of the story. And I'm going to do that by telling you the story of a document called the Guidelines on Constitutional Litigation, issued in 1988 by the Reagan administration. The goal of the document when it was conceived was to create a set of rules that would direct the way that DOJ lawyers argued cases in court. And because the DOJ, of course, represents the entire federal government, it was going to control the way that the federal government interacted with the judiciary. Those guidelines, the guidelines ended up being about 124 pages. They touched on hot-button issues like abortion, like criminal procedure. They also touched on technical issues. They claimed that they were neither conservative nor liberal. They did expressly claim to be originalists. Government litigators should only make arguments consistent with the original meaning of the Constitution, they said. But what my research shows is that this argument that they were meant to be neither liberal or conservative was intentional obfuscation. From the very beginning, the guidelines were seen as a tool by the most conservative elements inside the Reagan Justice Department as a way to advance the Reagan Revolution and vault themselves and the DOJ into the vanguard of that movement. Originalism was added to those guidelines as a tool to advance that deeply partisan and political project. So that's what I'll try to prove you to today. I'll also make an argument to you that if I'm right about that, this shows us a couple of things about both the guidelines and originalism. First of all, that the originalism project was an effort by the Reagan administration to take advantage of what I've named, and you know, if you don't like it, tell me maybe it's not the right words, but the politics of principle, right? The idea that the best way to advance a political and partisan agenda is to hide those policy goals behind a claim that you are advancing a principled interpretation of the Constitution. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the desire to control the federal government itself had as much to do with why the Reagan Department of Justice adopted originalism as any of the other reasons I mentioned earlier. And then finally, I think it is of critical importance that the Reagan administration took this on, announced it, and used it to advance their program because it helped define originalism as a partisan approach to constitutional interpretation. Okay, hopefully that's a lot of framing, and I hope it is useful. I'll move on to like the real history stuff now. The guidelines on constitutional litigation were conceived or originally advanced at a retreat on the eastern shore of Maryland just after Reagan's reelection. About 20 of the DOJ's leaders were there. They were there to plan and prepare for the new administration. They were excited, and they wanted to do things better. Incidentally, one of the great things about being a historian is you get to read people's mail, and so every once in a while you come across this document, and you're like, I cannot believe that this is great. And so one of these things I did is I found in Tex Lezar's papers, he's at the University of Texas, they made a transcript. I mean, they made a transcript of this meeting. They wrote all this stuff down. And so, it's like being in the room with them. It was a great find. But what that document shows, and other contemporaneous documents written in the Department of Justice, was that they wanted the DOJ to be much more effective in advancing the Reagan Revolution in the second term. They were frustrated by recalcitrant civil servants who they thought were not following the political direction as they should have been, as well as lukewarm political appointees. For those of you who know this period, many of the names will be familiar. Rex Lee at the Solicitor General's office, as well as a lot of his career lawyers there were particular frustrations. Ironically, Ted Olson, who is kind of a leading conservative lawyer even now, these more conservative leaders found him extremely frustrating for the same reason. And what they thought was that one of the things that these lawyers were doing were interfering with the Department of Justice's ability to drive forward important Reagan policies across the entire government. The best example here is affirmative action. William Bradford Reynolds was a real opponent of affirmative action. He ran the Civil Rights Division, and he was outraged by the fact that the Department of Justice thought that affirmative action should be unconstitutional, that Reagan and the Reagan administration was openly hostile to the idea, yet parts of Reagan's own government, indeed parts of the Department of Justice itself, like the FBI, continued to advance affirmative action policies. He wanted, as he said, for the DOJ to figure out a way to, quote, get those agencies in line. Reynolds is great. He is extremely quotable. So they came up with a lot of ideas. One of them was to create a litigation manual that would direct DOJ lawyers how to litigate certain cases. They came up with a list of topics that should be covered. That list of topics is identical, not just in substance, but in order, with the eventual published guidelines on constitutional litigation, except for one thing that I'll talk about in a minute. So by the end of that meeting, the guidelines were underway. And one thing I should mention about this, to make sure that we understand this context, this is before Ed Meese has even arrived at the department and before Ed Meese has dedicated the department to originalism. There was, thank you for this transcript, no discussion of originalism at that meeting at all. Okay, so you've got the guidelines, you've got the topics, they're driving forward. Meese arrives, dedicates the department to originalism, and the guidelines in constitutional litigation are then transformed from a non-originalist document advancing these policies to an originalist document advancing exactly the same policies, with one exception. The original draft of the guidelines on constitutional litigations did not have a section on individual rights. After the first draft was written, it got sent to the Deputy Attorney General's office. This is a very important Department of Justice office. They give feedback to Steve Markman, who wrote this. They say, Steve, this looks great. I love it. But look, a couple of days ago, we just lost control of Congress in the election, and we need to think hard about making these things less vulnerable to attack and challenge. So here's what we should do. We should add some provisions about individual rights to the document. That will make it harder to get rid of, not because we love it, not because we think they're right, but so we can give it these protect it from political attack. And he says, again, you find these documents and you're like, man, you wrote that down? And he said, and of course we can put our own spin on what these rights are going to be. For example, he says, and this is again, he says, for example, we could put a provision in there about how we're going to go beyond existing Supreme Court doctrine in protecting people's rights to double jeopardy, right? We can just put it in there. And he says, and he writes down, of course it's wrong. Of course, the Supreme Court has never agreed to this, but we can put some weasel words in there saying, oh, sometimes or when available, and that way we won't have to do it. We'll get the good parts of protecting individual rights, but we'll never have to do it. The final draft of the guidelines doesn't include the double jeopardy idea, but it does include other rights claims that had been advanced by the Reagan administration, including things about the Contracts Clause. And most importantly, it has this new section that DAG's office recommended. Okay. So, what we end up with after those changes is a set of guidelines that are consistent in every way with pre-existing Reagan administration policies. They take originalism and they interpret originalism to match almost exactly the goals of the Reagan administration. This was not entirely easy to do. They had to do, and I can talk about some of this, a little kind of theoretical tap dancing about making the difference between original intent and original meaning so that they could make peace with one of the most important scholars of originalism and keep him on side without really contradicting him. But when it was finished, DOJ leadership, when they saw the final draft, had a hard time finding any disagreement with the substance at all. In fact, Reynolds, again, he's so quotable, he said, "I don't understand why we wouldn't issue this. The department has already, in public, taken every single one of these positions," right? So entirely consistent with Reagan administration policies. But again, here, if I can just be a historian, there are moments when you follow these people, you kind of get to know them, and my heart broke for Steve Markman when I saw this part. He was the person who wrote these documents. He put 3 years, 2.5 years of effort into reaching out across the Department of Justice, coming up with arguments that would work, making sure that all of these different components were agreed with the document that he put together. He wrote speeches and gave speeches supporting originalism, following Meese's embrace of the theory, saying it's the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution, and he submits it to Meese. And half of the department, including the new Deputy Attorney General, says we shouldn't issue these in any way that can bind our attorneys. Because if we do, it might stop our ability to carry out policies that we think are important. And it's just awful. You read this, my heart breaks when he says, wait, first of all, no one disagrees with any of it. Second of all, we've all been arguing for 2.5 years that if anything in this document is inconsistent with originalism, then it's illegitimate and we shouldn't be doing it anyway. But Meese, leadership says, too bad, Steve. We're unwilling to be bound by this document that you wrote, right? So they issue it as a guide, as an aid, not as binding guidance. Okay. So what does this show? Lots of things. I think the first one is this seems to me to be a compelling example of what I've called the politics of principle. It seems to me that the explicit plan among the members of the Reagan DOJ was to use constitutional principle to hide their partisan goals. I think you can see this in the fact that the goals were created before originalism even arrived, by the fact that they explicitly discussed taking these kinds of options. And at the end, even when it was all lined up, they were still unwilling to bind themselves to the document. Second of all, I think that this shows the importance of originalism as a tool for controlling the government. By taking policy and political arguments and transforming them into constitutional arguments, DOJ shifted intergovernmental disputes from grounds where they could lose it, for example, on affirmative action, to like the Department of Labor, right? The Department of Labor said, we think it's good in this way, we've got these statutes, we got to fight this out in the interagency process. I love, we're in a crowd where you can talk about the interagency process and not explain it. It's, we can fight this out. You're moving into a constitutional issue where the DOJ says, we're in charge of this, we know these rules, and we are not discussing those issues for you. We're doing it the way that you were doing it the way that we want to do. So I'll save the historiographical. I think that is far underestimated in the literature. I think the arguments about judges, originalism as a way to pick judges, are very true now. Much less true then, in part because there wasn't a big bench of originalist judges to pick from. It was a new theory. I think the idea that it was a tool to attack the Warren Court is true in a way, but heavily overemphasized because originalist arguments were going to fail at the Supreme Court. You only had Justice Rehnquist. You could see many of these lawyers, including Mike McConnell, real conservative stalwarts, arguing on the DOJ, we should be careful about this originalism stuff because it's going to get shot down at the Supreme Court, right? So I'm not sure in the short term it was an effective strategy. And then the rhetorical issues, I think, do play an important role. You can see them talking about that. So I think that this concern in advancing originalism has been much underemphasized. So at the end of the day, it also means that originalism starts to look not just like a theory of constitutional interpretation, but like a Republican theory of constitutional interpretation. Okay, do I have like 2 minutes? Am I still? I'll be really quick. I've been really hard on these lawyers. I've been saying that they're advancing this politics of principle and that they're obfuscating their political and their partisan goals. And I just will say in passing, I do not think that they are exactly like lawyers for other presidential administrations, but again, among this crowd, I think we can all recognize and understand that in some ways this should be totally unsurprising. These lawyers, their job was to help advance a particular presidential administration's goals. That's their job. That's what they're doing, right? And so the fact that they did this in a particular way isn't illegitimate. I think every presidential administration has lawyers who do something like this. And it also is not inconsistent with the idea that many of them may have thought that this was the right way to interpret the Constitution. I'm not saying that they didn't believe it was right, but I am saying that what was driving this was the institutional context in which these lawyers worked, where their job was to advance a presidential administration, and they did it using this politics of principle tool. So, thank you.
So I'm just going to take a few minutes to add some thoughts to these really remarkable papers, and then we'll open it up because I think we'll still have maybe 20 minutes for questions. In the 1970s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan called the Republican Party the party of ideas. And what I like about the combination of these three papers is that they help us to better understand how those ideas were formed, how they were deployed, and how they were the function not only of kind of an intellectual exercise or a philosophical set of beliefs, but political exigencies, sort of material and political needs. And I think that helps us to better root and to better understand these ideas and some of the inconsistencies with these ideas as well. In the case of David's work, he is recovering this idea of Reagan as an intellectual. And this is something, Reagan was something of an autodidact. There's this great book called The Education of Ronald Reagan that looks at the ways that all of these books that David was talking about were something that Reagan encountered and absorbed during his years in the 1950s working for General Electric. And I'd be curious to hear David speak more about how he sees Reagan's relationship to these ideas. Do you see him as a popularizer of existing ideas, somebody who generated new ideas, or a kind of intellectual policy entrepreneur who's taking those ideas and applying them in novel ways to politics? And is there something kind of syncretic about the ideas that he's developing, that he's not just pulling from these books, but also a set of religious beliefs and other sources of ideas?
It doesn't necessarily reduce the
Particular ideas also at the heart of Logan and Austin's papers, and this idea, originalism, they both show is not a pure intellectual exercise or theoretical innovation, but the product of a number of material and political realities, deeply rooted in the political project of Reagan-era conservatism. It is an idea that, as Logan shows, was fundamentally altered, and I think he does this more in the larger paper, but it was fundamentally altered to make it more politically palatable. That originalism had been associated with segregationists and opposition to Brown v. Board, and so it had to be tweaked a little bit so that people didn't immediately dismiss it as kind of retrograde and racist. So there's a shift to the ideas in order to make them politically palatable. And I think that within that, there's a lot to chew on in this paper. And I'm going to just throw out a couple of questions that you can answer or not. But one of the things that I was thinking of, particularly in the shift that Markman makes to originalism, this idea that it moves from original intent to original meaning, what's the relationship of that to textualism? Are we starting to grade into other sort of judicial philosophies? And it also, because this is such a smart and important contribution to the literature on the administrative state, I know that you have Chevron in a footnote, but the entire time I'm thinking, well, if they're trying to discipline these agencies, it feels like that idea of Chevron deference, which lands in the middle of the Reagan administration, is going to be something that the DOJ in particular is wrestling with as they try to take control away from these agencies or get these agencies to fall in line. And as Austin shows, originalism was also a key political tool for coalition building and coalition maintenance. In his important work that is no doubt going to be a stellar dissertation and later book, Austin persuasively argues that originalism was one of the administration's deliverables to the religious right, perhaps its most consequential for the administration. Now, the paper looks at evangelicals, and I'm curious whether originalism was solely aimed at them, or whether it played a role in the efforts to forge a religious right that also included not just evangelicals, but Catholics and Mormons, groups that don't necessarily have this idea of biblical inerrancy. Does originalism appeal to these groups, or what was the appeal to these groups? Because, of course, Antonin Scalia is Catholic, so is there another way in for other religious groups, or is there a way that biblical literalism still attaches for them? So in doing all of this work that Logan and Austin have done, they've located the centrality of the executive branch and electoral politics in the construction and deployment of a judicial philosophy. So the executive branch is playing a pretty big role in something that we often think about as part of the Supreme Court. And that raises all sorts of questions, both about this as a philosophy, about the coalitions and political project that originalism serves. So I think that there's tons to chew on here. It's really smart and innovative work, and I'm excited to hear the discussion that follows.